Welcome back. Today I'm going to go over the install procedure for an AOD, or basically a Ford automatic transmission. My torque converter here, this is a 10.5 inch, it's aftermarket. It really doesn't matter how we're going to do the procedure. I'm going to go ahead and pull this off, and then I'm going to go ahead and reinstall it. Before I do that, I just want to note, because this is already currently it's properly installed. You can see about the depth here. You can see my finger. It's about an inch. You can, inch and a half, inch and a quarter. Anyways, I'll go over that in a second. Now, this transmission was built by Lentech Automatics. So they actually dyno test and pressure test all these before they ship them to a customer. So this torque converter is not bone dry. It's actually got some film in it, even though it's been quite a while since I bought it and it's been sitting waiting for me to finish. So in my case, I don't have to worry about this thing being bone dry. But if this is something you order from another vendor, you're probably going to want to put a little bit of fluid in here. I'm going to go over that. I'm going to go ahead and pull this guy out right now. So we're going to go ahead and just pull this guy back. I'm not sure how well it's going to show up on camera, but there's already, you can see some fluid. You can actually see some transmission fluid in there. But the key thing you want to note here, these little flat lands on your torque converter, these are going to be important because this shaft is what slides into the front end where the pump is and the gears mesh up. So I'm going to go over basically, this is pretty simple. There's a couple things to pay attention to. If you bought this online or you got it from some other manufacturer and it's not pressure tested or whatever, you probably want to take just a little bit of transmission fluid, dump in maybe a quart inside of this, and then fill this around with your finger. A couple other things to note is, if you're just doing a traditional transmission install where you're bringing the transmission up flat, you can dump in a couple quarts and go ahead and start filling your torque converter. In my case, I'm installing the transmission attached to my motor, so it's going to be pitched down. So any fluid that I put in here, quite a bit is going to dump out, and it won't hurt anything. It's going to go in the oil pan. And I have, in this case, I'm using an old drive shaft yoke to plug this, but you want to plug in because otherwise it'll just not only go through the entire transmission out onto your floor. But that's the first piece you want to do. Take your torque converter, lubricate it a little bit on the inside, and then we're going to go over back to the front of the transmission. And from here, you just want to note these input shafts here. You see these kind of steps here. When I go ahead and put in the torque converter, I'm going to be rotating around clockwise, the same direction the engine turns. And what it's going to do, slowly as I turn it, it's going to mesh in the gear. It's going to kind of clip on here, kind of initial clunk. Then when it turns around and lines up again, it's going to hit another clunk. And then if you remember the two pieces that are on the front of the torque converter, it's going to slide inside this seal here on the front. And that's what we talk about, just having a little bit of lubrication on here. You just don't want, a dry seal on there, especially because when the thing's going to start up, it is going to be dry. So just having a little bit of film in there, probably not a bad idea. Okay, so now I'm going to go ahead and install my torque converter. Get it on. And you can see how this thing's pretty far out. So we're going to see the first clunk. We keep turning, and it's kind of like when you have it. You can see it's not quite all the way in yet. There you go. And it's kind of like you'll know it when you feel it. There's kind of like two steps. It goes in, boom, boom. Probably the best way to describe it. About an inch, inch and a quarter. If you have this thing too far out, you'll basically burn up your pump if you don't have this thing installed right. So really, that's the first key thing you don't want to screw up. You definitely want this thing to push all the way back in. Now the next thing you want to pay attention to, and this is just simply just to make life easy on you and make sure that this is the other thing you could potentially screw up, is its drain plug. Easiest way to do this so you line it up is this flywheel will flex plate will obviously be installed on the engine. So what you want to do when you go ahead and install the flex plate is you want to make sure that when you bolt this guy up, And this is why if you have it down, if you line up the flex plate on the crank and you have it down, you can see here, I have it lined up here. So this is already lined up. I don't have to worry about this smushing into this. I don't think on this one you really can because it's recessed, but some of these aren't. They stick out a little bit. And if you tried to mash this in here, again, you could be smashing. This thing needs to move a little bit, and if it didn't, you smash it in here, you basically burn up the pump on this. Okay, something I just thought about. I want to make sure that I explain in case anybody is using a stock style torque converter. This is an aftermarket, it's a custom built for my application, what I plan on the track. I think it's around a 2800 RPM stall. What you're going to see is different is, you see here I have bolt holes. So on mine, when the flex plate mounts, I'm actually going to be bolting my flex plate to my torque converter. If you're using a more stock style, instead of having these bolt holes, there'll be studs sticking out. And Ford sells them. You can get them right from LMR. Pretty much standard bolts. And they actually bolt on. So in case you're watching, there's no mystery here, but that is the difference. Aftermarket oftentimes has these bolts, and your stock style have studs. Either way, it's still attaching to your flex plate. Obviously, this is just the torque converter part, and then when we go to install it in the engine, that's the other thing you want to be careful of when you're moving it around. In my case, I'm going to have the engine and the transmission connected together, so I won't have that issue. But before you go ahead and make this up, if you're pushing it up and getting it up underneath the car, before you do that final mating, make sure that the thing is all the way in. That's the critical piece of this. Okay, welcome to the future. I mentioned previously about how you want to have your torque converter with the drain hole down basically at the bottommost portion. However, that was probably with a stock 302. In my case, and others probably will find this, the distance, especially with this 351 oil pan and the oversized, this is a 7-quart, it's bigger. So I remember when I took mine out, I did have my bolts down, if you will. So there is an access plate here. When you're pushing this in, just make it clear. So there's an access plate, and that's actually what this is for, is to be able to attach your torque converter to your flex plate. Now notice, the key thing here is hopefully you can see this, I can actually turn that easily with my finger. Okay, so I know that I have the spacing right, because we mentioned that 2 clunks as it goes in. That actually says that in the manual, by the way, just so it it is clear. It literally says, it mentions 2 clunks in the manual. With that said, a stock converter, it's going to have studs off of the converter. Mine doesn't. Mine has bolts. I think these are 3/8 fine thread. I think that's like a 24 pitch maybe. These are 14 millimeter, but again, yours might be slightly different. So I do have it lined up. You notice that I now have this to the side. So this is, it's really going to depend on your oil pan. We'll just go ahead and throw these in. And the torque spec on these is 20 to 34 foot-pounds. Again, that's for a stock converter. I'm going to just use, because I'm basically going to use a little 3/8 ratchet Milwaukee. This is rated, I think, to like 35 or 40 foot-pounds. So I'm just going to go ahead and cinch these down. Okay, so we have that one torqued. And you're just going to take the crank bolt. You're going to go ahead and put a 1/2-inch socket. Well, I'm sorry, it's actually a 5/8 socket. Just use a 1/2-inch wrench because you need a little bit of persuasion. You're just going to turn the crank clockwise until you get to the next bolt hole. Now I'm hanging this thing from the crane, so it's moving around a little bit. So there you go. And so on and so forth. We'll go around. We'll do all 4 of them. And then we'll put our cover back on. So to be clear, with the stock converter, it's 20 to 34 foot-pounds. I think these are pretty much the same size bolts. I'm going to go ahead and get my torque wrench. I've gone ahead and bolted these down. I've cinched them down, but I'm going to go ahead and grab my torque wrench and just make sure that I've got the right torque spec. Obviously, these are critical bolts. Just a quick tip for you. Because when you're torquing this down, obviously the crank, the torque converter is free to spin. So as you start torquing this thing down, you start getting around 35, 40 foot-pounds. I'm taking these right to about, I think 38, 40 foot-pounds. But as you get up in there, it'll start to turn. Just take a little screwdriver, put it between your oil pan, and engage it with the flex plate, and it'll hold it right in place for you. Okay, so the only real by the ways, there's really not much to mess up here, as I said, and I'll repeat multiple times. The biggest thing is making sure that torque converter is all the way in, properly seated. Like I said, if you cannot rotate that torque converter when you mate these two together, you need to take it apart. There's something wrong. Either your flex plate's wrong between, say, a C6 AOD or something like that, or your torque converter when you were putting it in, or maybe it moved forward. And then if you squeeze those together, what you're going to do is you're going to burn up your pump. And then this is a very simple thing, but just so you can plan ahead. These are 3/8/16 bolt. You're not going to find something like a 1/2 inch or short at your local hardware store, most likely. I tried my local Obashan, I tried my local Lowe's. Neither one of them had anything short, so I had to cut them down and just clean up the end of it. When you put this cover on, just to show you, there's not a lot of space here. So I just had to make this so this, because you're going to have a bolt that's going to fit down in here. I don't want to put it on right now. But that's just an by the way, just so that you don't get here and have to get to the same point. You can just go ahead and, if you have something short like this on a 3/8/16, great. If not, you might have to cut it down. Okay, with that, I hope this helps you on your torque converter install. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you on the next one.